I don't have enough vocabulary. How many times has a learner said that to you? Often learners feel that however much vocabulary they learn, there's always more. There's always another word, other words that they find in texts which block their comprehension, other words that they need when they're trying to express themselves and can't. And as teachers, we know that there's a phenomenal amount of vocabulary in the English language. How can we possibly expect to cover even a fraction? So, how many words are there in the English language? That's actually a question which is impossible to answer because it depends what you mean by a word. What is a word? We saw in the last unit, for example, that round can be an adjective, an adverb, a preposition, a noun, and so on. Okay, so do you count it as one word or do you count it as 5 different words? What about the word head? Is my head the same as the head of a bed or the head of a company? Is that one word or 3 words? Obviously there's no right answer particularly, but which way you go, what solution you decide on will radically affect the number of words that you think there are in the English language. However, I suppose the most usual estimate is round about 250,000 to 300,000 words. So why are there so many? There are certainly more than in many other languages. The answer, of course, lies in the fact that for nearly 1,000 years there was an incredible influence on the formation of the English language from other languages, other different languages. English was originally a Celtic language, but there are now very few words which we still use that come from the Celtic language. A few place names, Cornwall, Kent, Cumberland, geographical features, Tor, Crag, Coombe. Similarly, the effect of Latin when the Romans invaded was relatively minor. In the later Roman period, there are a few religious words that come in, food words that come in and so on, but relatively few, as I said. The real start of the English language came with the invasion of the Teutonic tribes, when what is now called Old English or Anglo-Saxon formed. And today, about 15 to 25% of the words that we use come, or of the words in English, come from the Saxon tribes. That may not seem very much, but although it's only 15 to 25% of the total number, they're often the most frequent words. House, wife, child, high, strong, live, eat, meet. All of those words have a Saxon origin. Then, between the 8th and the 10th centuries, the Viking invasions happened, mainly in North and East England. And from them we've got words, for example, with sk, skill, skin, whisk, are Scandinavian words. Or words with a hard k and g, egg, give, kid. Final influence on English came with the Norman invasion, and this was an enormous influence. For 300 years, French was the language of government, the law, the royal court and the high society, education, medicine, all forms of learning. It wasn't until the 14th century that the English kings actually started to speak English. Previously it was only French. So for 300 years the English of the normal people was coexisting alongside the French of the educated classes. And when in the 14th century it was decided that English should be the language, for example, of law and government and so on, when people did start speaking English, even those in the higher levels of society, there was obviously an incredible overlap, a transference of one language to the other. One nice example of that is the words knife and fork. Knife comes from the Saxon, because that's what the ordinary people used to eat, knives and fingers. Whereas forks, well, they were something that only the educated higher society classes actually used, and so fork is a French word. When we talk about Latin-based words and words coming from Latin, in fact what we really mean usually is that they came via French. As I said before, very few came directly from Latin at the time of the Romans. So, about 300,000 words in the English language, but how many of those words are actually known by the average native speaker? Probably around about 20 to 30,000, that's the estimate that's most usually used. But of course not all of those words are used every day. We use a much smaller number of words frequently. And that number includes words which we understand receptively but don't necessarily use productively at all. So that's potentially what we're faced with teaching. But how do we do it? How do we cope with the sheer number of words? How many of those words do our learners actually need, and which ones? How do we select the words that we want to teach? And then how do we go about doing it? What's the best way to teach vocabulary to ensure that the learners do remember as much as possible? We'll be going on to looking at that in the final part of this section. However, first of all, we're going to look at lexical systems. Words don't exist in isolation, they form relationships with each other. And we're going to be looking at those relationships because I'm going to be arguing that by taking account of those relationships, we can actually make the learning of our students much easier.